Content note: this video discusses wartime capture, forced relocation, and sexual violence in a historical context. Descriptions are non-graphic and intended for a mature audience. Across a sea of grass where the horizon is a permanent idea rather than a fixed place, the thunder of horses is more than an army. It is a changing world. When the Mongol horsemen rode out in the 13th century, they did not merely topple cities and break walls, they rearranged households, families, and names. Men fell under the arrows and banners, and women, wives, daughters, servants, noble consorts, and strangers found their lives bent toward outcomes no one could have planned. Some were taken into new houses, some were sold, some vanished into markets and courts, and some rose into strange and terrible company beside conquerors. To tell the untold fate of these women is to move between campfire gossip and court chronicles, between the cold arithmetic of conquest and the luminous private lives that survive in fragments of letters, law codes, and legends. Imagine a village on the edge of a fertile river plain. The morning is the same as it has ever been. Smoke from cooking fires, children chasing flocks, a woman, perhaps a weaver or a potter, looking out toward the steppe for the returning men. Then the sky changes. A dust column appears, the sound of many hooves, and a command is given in an unfamiliar tongue. What follows is not uniform. The Mongol campaigns varied with strategy, locale, and moment. Sometimes the conquerors slaughtered, sometimes they spared skilled craftsmen, sometimes they demanded ransom, and often they took people as part of the spoils. A great many women were taken at this moment of upheaval, some because they were desirable to a commander, some because they could knit and cook and run a tent, some because they were currency in a world being rapidly recalculated. To be captured did not mean a single fate. At one end were the elite women, wives, daughters, noble hostages, who were absorbed into the Khan's extended household or given to high-ranking commanders. At the other were the nameless domestic servants, wet nurses, young women sold into slave markets across newly opened routes. In between were the ambiguous roles, concubines who might become influential hostages, who might be fostered and returned, women who might be married into a new family as part of an alliance, or who might remain unacknowledged labor in a yurt-lined camp. This range of outcomes made the experience of capture not only traumatic, but also unpredictably political, social, and generational. The Mongol world was not simply one of leather tents and raids. It was also courts with shades of hierarchy, protocol, and prestige. As the empire grew, so did the variety of households. The nomadic yurt bearing a family lineage, the command tent where a general kept spoils and retainers, and the imperial court where marriages and alliances were performed with careful diplomacy. Captured women were moved through these worlds like pieces on a board. In the camps, women might be integrated into the domestic machinery, cooking, child-rearing, textile production, and managing herds. The Mongol household was often a multifunctional space where the lines between domestic labor and political activity could blur. Some women, especially those of noble birth, could find themselves near the center of decision-making, advising husbands or sons, managing property, or even leading in the absence of men. In the courts of the great Khans, wives and consorts held visible and sometimes decisive roles. Their dresses, hats, and public presence were political symbols, and their networks could shape appointments and succession. But for many captives, the transition from village to camp to court was less an elevation than an erasure. Familiar names replaced, autonomy stripped, memories reframed to make sense of a life now embedded in someone else's household. Marriage in the Mongol imperial context was a political act, and women were both the means and the message. When a family or polity surrendered, the transfer of women, through marriage, exchange, or distribution, was part of consolidating victory. Some women were married to Mongol leaders as a way of securing loyalty. Others were parceled out as rewards to commanders and warriors. Concubinage was a common institution. A captured woman might be taken into a household as a concubine and over time establish a secure position, especially if she bore sons. The line between concubinage and recognized consort could be porous. A woman who produced an heir had an altered status. This transactional view of marriage need not be read only as cold calculus. It also carried opportunity and danger. A woman married to a powerful man might gain protection, wealth, and influence. She could manage lands, steward trade routes, and become a voice heard in the tent of governance. Yet the same system placed women as instruments of diplomacy and reward, decreasing their agency in the short term. Their bodies and reproductive labor were politicized, and the lineage they produced could retroactively define their value within the new order. History remembers rulers with banners and dates, but the most arresting evidence of fate comes in the margins. A name left in a chronicle, a line in a ransom list, a fragmentary household account. There are stories of women who were taken from homelands and, by force or favor, rose to become arbiters of palace life. There are equal numbers of anonymous accounts, women described in dispatches as taken, given, or sold. Consider two hypothetical women, each born in the same year and captured in the same campaign. One, of noble birth, is brought to the tent of a general, and later married to a lieutenant. She bears a child who is raised alongside the conqueror's own. Over the years she acquires property and some voice in local disputes. Her children's names become part of the regional memory. The other, a weaver from a nearby hamlet, is taken to a larger city, sold into servitude, and spent a life whose end is recorded only in a single tax list or not at all. Both fates are products of the same sweep of history. The difference is often luck, status, and the strategic needs of those who carried them away. These contrasts complicate easy narratives about the Mongol treatment of captured women. While some sources depict a brutal and acquisitive system that routinely enslaved and abused, other records show that conquerors valued domestic skills and sometimes protected or even elevated those they took. The truth is not an either-or, it is a spectrum shaped by context, region, and time. One of the most profound long-term consequences of capture was a mixed generation. Children born of unions between Mongol men and captured women, whether through marriage or concubinage, occupied liminal spaces. They could become bridges between cultures, bilingual and bicultural, able to navigate Mongol and local customs. In some cases, such children were strategically important. They could inherit assets, claim rank, and secure loyalties. But the identity these children carried was fraught. To their maternal kin, they might be both familiar and foreign. To their paternal kin, they were heirs and reminders of conquest. The maternal lineage could provide knowledge, crafts, and local ties. The paternal lineage provided arms, horses, and political cover. Over generations, this intermingling shaped the genetic, cultural, and political map of Eurasia. The presence of women taken in conquest and the families they produced became a durable part of the empire's social fabric. Where armies moved, markets followed. The Mongol advance opened trade routes and legal frameworks that accelerated the circulation of goods and of people. Markets in conquered cities and along caravan routes bought and sold captive labor. Women, children, skilled artisans, and domestic workers were frequently itemized in lists. Prices were negotiated, contracts drawn. At the same time, Mongol law and pragmatism sometimes offered protection. The Khans had a vested interest in stable households and productive camps. Laws and customs could regulate the treatment of captives, sometimes offering ways for a woman to secure a place in a household or redress in the face of abuse. The record is complicated. In some cases, legal status could be attained. A woman who married into a Mongol household might be recognized, receive gifts, or claim property. In other contexts, women were clearly part of the slave economies that accompanied conquest, their lives constrained by ownership-like relations. Trade, law, and conquest were braided together, and the fate of many captured women was negotiated in that braided space. It is a mistake to think of captured women only as passive victims. Within the constraints of their positions, many exercised agency, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. Elite women in Mongol courts could wield power by arranging marriages, stewarding land, or acting as regents. There are recorded instances where women negotiated, conveyed messages, and intervened in disputes. Even women who began as captives sometimes carved influence through kin networks by producing heirs or by leveraging their roles as cultural intermediaries. This agency was not universal and did not obliterate the harms of capture, but it complicates the narrative of one-directional subjugation. A woman who had once been the daughter of a vanquished lord could, in time, be an indispensable broker between her original community and the Mongol power that now controlled it. Oral histories, family legends, and some chronicles preserve memory of women who shaped outcomes behind the scenes, the unseen hands that steered succession, inheritance, and even diplomacy. We must not romanticize. The exercise of agency often existed beside, and sometimes because of, profound violence. Sexual assault, forced marriages, and the seizure of children were part of the record. Traumas whose traces are painful to read and harder still to render without sensationalism. Yet to stop there would be to deny the ways women adapted, survived, and sometimes transformed their circumstances. Memory, too, is partial. The victors wrote their chronicles. The vanished left few archives. Women's experiences, especially those outside elite circles, are often preserved in the margins, in the naming of towns, in the persistence of crafts, in the children who carried dual heritages. The silence of sources about certain classes of women is not absence of experience but absence of record. It asks us to read more carefully between lines, to listen to folk tales, to weigh the evidence of material culture, garments, jewelry, burial goods, that hints at lives rearranged by conquest. When we look for the fates of captured women, we rely on a polyphony of sources: Persian and Chinese chronicles, legal codes, travel accounts, archaeological remains, and later, folklore. Each source carries its own biases. Imperial chroniclers might celebrate the absorption of rivals through marriage. Clerics might lament the moral cost of conquest. Traders might note the commodification of people in passing. Archaeology and dress studies give us another angle. The presence of particular garments or grave goods can suggest the movement of women across cultural zones and the persistence of certain practices within Mongol households. Together, these sources reveal a mixed, messy picture, one in which the fate of a woman could be shaped by politics, skill, kin, and chance. Captivity often meant a forced crossing of language and faith. A woman brought into a Mongol tent might learn Mongolian, adapt her cooking to new diets, and encounter different ritual practices. Conversely, Mongol households that absorbed foreign women also absorbed customs, foods, crafts, and religious ideas that could alter the household's identity. Conversion and religious tolerance were practical matters. The Mongol elite often allowed diverse practices as long as loyalty remained intact. For many captured women, negotiation of faith and speech was not merely spiritual, it was survival and strategy. Over time, syncretism took hold. A household with members from multiple backgrounds could become a microcosm of the empire. Rituals mixed, languages blended, and new forms of identity emerged. These hybrid spaces reveal how women, through weaving, cooking, and child-rearing, helped to stitch together the cultural map of a vast and rapidly changing empire. Capture did not always mean permanent subjection. There were runaways and rebellions, negotiated ransoms and escapes. Families who paid ransom recovered loved ones. Communities sheltered women who fled. And some captives bided their time until they could re-emerge in a different landscape. Resistance took many forms: quiet disobedience, preservation of native customs, secret communication with kin, and overt flight when opportunity allowed. These acts are small and often invisible in the grand narratives of conquest, but they are no less real. They remind us that history's sweep is never totalizing. Individual choices, cunning, and solidarity could alter fates even within the overarching brutality of war. Centuries after the first conquests, the descendants of captured women populated the provinces and palaces of successor khanates, carried skills and stories across borders, and helped form new identities that were neither wholly Mongol nor wholly local. The legacies of capture are visible in place names, in the blending of artistic motifs, in genealogies that recall foreign mothers, and in the threads of cultural exchange, textiles, recipes, and craft techniques that cross what had been wartime lines. The memory of those women is also political. In some histories they are spoken of as victims, in others as mothers of dynasties. Both are true. The network of households that arose from conquest became the social engine of an empire and later of its successor states. The intimate labor of captured women, raising children, running houses, tending livestock, was a hidden foundation of imperial life. To tell the untold fate of captured women is not to produce a definitive catalogue. It is to enter into a conversation between fragments and inference, between the public voice of chronicles and the private testimony of material traces. It is to hold together stories of violence and stories of survival, to acknowledge the moral cost of conquest while recognizing the resilience and complexity of the women whose lives it reshaped. History, like the steppe wind, moves in currents seldom visible from a distance. If we lean close to the ground, we find threads. A dress at an archaeological site, a passing mention in a diplomat's letter, an oral tale about a woman who taught a conqueror's son to read the stars. Each is a clue. Together they assemble an image that is neither wholly bleak nor comfortably redemptive. A mosaic of lives forced into new seams, of mothers who bore children of two worlds, of women who were bargained, bought, mourned, honored, forgotten, and spoken of again, across generations. This is not heroic history, nor is it a catalogue of atrocities to be consumed. It is an attempt to name the varied fates of those who did not choose the battles that rearranged their homes. In naming them, those who became wives in strange tents, those who served unknown masters, those who leveraged their positions into quiet power, we restore a degree of humanity to stories that empires often compress into numbers. The past, when listened to closely, will always insist on complexity. The untold fate of captured women in Mongol conquests is precisely that: complex, painful, and vital to understanding how an empire remade the human map of Eurasia.